In 1997, a movie turned the Titanic into something an entire generation remembers. Almost everything you picture from that night is wrong. The iceberg nobody saw until it was 37 seconds away. The 300-foot gash that does not exist. Two ships 23 miles apart, both swearing there was a third ship between them. And 2.5 miles down, the strangest detail of all, the bow is almost perfectly intact. The stern looks like it was hit by a missile. For 113 years, we only had wreckage and witness statements. Then a survey team mapped the entire site down to the millimeter and rebuilt the Titanic full size on a screen. For the first time, we have an autopsy. April 14th, 1912. 11:30 at night, 10 minutes before Titanic struck. And it wasn't just the two lookouts. Survivor after survivor said the same thing. We never saw the iceberg. Charles Juhin, the ship's chief baker, testified, "Sir, I am quite sure I saw nothing." Frederick Fleet, the lookout in the crow's nest, said there was a dark shape ahead, but he didn't strike the bell right away because he couldn't be sure what it was, and he didn't want to raise a false alarm. If it were an iceberg, he said, there should have been white water breaking at its base. He never saw it. And then there's George Simons, whose account is stranger still. "I could smell the ice. I just couldn't see it." So was the iceberg really hiding? Researchers analyzing the wreck have an explanation. That night, the Gulf Stream ran straight into an unusually cold patch of ice water, and it created a thermal inversion. Normally, the higher you go, the colder the air gets. That night, it was the opposite. Freezing seawater chilled the air sitting directly on top of it. So the closer you were to the surface, the colder it was. That sharp difference between cold air below and warmer air above bent the light and formed a refraction layer across the sea. Nature had laid a sheet of distorting glass over the ocean. Now imagine looking at the world through that glass. Everything gets warped. That alone isn't fatal. The fatal part is that a layer like this creates a blind band, and the iceberg sat inside it, invisible. It gets worse. Distant starlight scattered across that same layer, like a smear on a windshield you can't wipe off. So even if you looked directly at it, you saw nothing. And the ship had no binoculars in the crow's nest. The key to the locker holding them had left with an officer, who was reassigned before the ship sailed. The result was the same either way. They could smell the ice, they could not see the iceberg. But that still isn't the worst of it. There was a third effect, a superior mirage. Because light was bending as it passed through that layer, the horizon appeared to lift, and an iceberg standing 60 feet above the water sat perfectly inside that raised false horizon, which is exactly why the lookouts never saw the white water breaking at its base. There's nothing more to say. That night, there really was no iceberg to see. Nature had stacked 3 separate illusions on top of each other and hidden it completely. So Titanic went straight in. 11:39 at night, 37 seconds before impact, 500 yards away. 2 lookouts suddenly saw it. An iceberg, appearing out of nowhere, directly ahead. In the movie, and for 100 years before it, everyone believed the same thing. The first officer's order to turn was the blow that killed Titanic. Because the turn dragged her whole starboard side along the iceberg and opened 5 watertight compartments at once. If she had hit the ice head-on, people said, she would never have sunk. Many engineers have argued exactly that, because Titanic had 16 watertight compartments. The design allowed for 1 compartment flooded, no effect on the voyage. 3 flooded, power stays on. Even with 4 compartments completely full, she could stay afloat and wait for rescue. But that glancing turn opened 5. For 110 years, nobody questioned that picture. Then in 2022, a survey team took submersibles down 12,500 feet to build a full-size 1-to-1 model of the wreck. And they found something nobody expected. Where was the tear that opened 5 compartments? Apart from a single opening in compartment 3, there was nothing but a line of small punctures, like pinholes. Think about what that means. What kind of iceberg strike opens a 1-inch steel hull across 5 compartments, a run of 300 feet? For a century, researchers tried to explain the gap. They proposed brittle steel that failed in freezing water. They proposed a defective keel. The most extreme version claimed Titanic never sank at all, that her sister ship Olympic was swapped in for insurance. But now, the autopsy is in. The 300-foot gash does not exist. Add up every opening across the fatal compartments, and the total damaged area is smaller than 2 sheets of A4 paper. It's like filling an entire bathtub with a water pistol. How does a hole that small kill a 40,000-ton ship? It doesn't make sense. Unless the collision we've all pictured for 100 years never actually happened. To explain how 2 sheets of paper sank Titanic, investigators turned to another ship. The SS Great Eastern. Launched 54 years before Titanic, she was the giant of her age, and on one voyage she scraped an uncharted rock off the American coast. It tore open her outer hull, 83 feet long, 9 feet wide. That damaged area was roughly 60 times larger than Titanic's 2 sheets of paper. Did Great Eastern sink? No, she listed slightly and sailed on into port. So a double-hulled ship with 16 watertight compartments, holed in a few small places, how did those pinholes take her down? Researchers spent 3 years on it. And this is the conclusion they reached. Titanic did not hit the iceberg, she rode up onto it. That famous scrape along the starboard side, the zipper of small punctures, that wasn't the fatal wound. The fatal moment was that this 40,000-ton hull, traveling at about 25 miles an hour, ran up onto a shelf of ice extending underwater and was lifted. Then, because of the momentum, she slid back off it, and in that instant, the hull plating along the bottom was squeezed with enormous force. Even then, her double bottom should have held. But here is the cruel coincidence. The starboard side had already been perforated, that line of small holes. Think of a tile with hairline cracks in it. With your bare hands, you can't break it, but rest it across your knee and press from below, and it snaps along the cracks. Titanic was the same physics. The moment she rode up on that ice, the joints between her hull plates on the starboard side could not hold against the weight of 40,000 tons, levering down from beneath. The rivets along the keel and the starboard side began to fail, one after another, like machine gun fire under the black water. Hundreds of rivet heads sheared away in seconds, and freezing seawater, under enormous pressure, poured in through every open seam. Survivor accounts describe it exactly this way. Not a crash, a grinding. Lawrence Beasley, a second-class passenger and a science teacher, put it like this. There came what seemed to me nothing more than an extra heave of the engines. There was no sound of a crash or anything else. But the real horror was hidden inside those silent physics. And here's the detail the movie captured perfectly. After the impact, nobody felt in danger. Ice knocked loose from the berg skittered across the deck, and passengers kicked it around like footballs. Nobody knew. The cold Atlantic night that would take more than 1,500 lives had already begun. 20 minutes of silence. Midnight. 23 miles away, the captain of the SS Californian was watching through binoculars. So why didn't Californian come? She was close enough to reach the wreck in time. And she was carrying thousands of blankets and relief supplies. Why did she just sit there and watch? There's the well-known explanation. Californian's wireless operator had been told to shut up by Titanic's operator, so he switched off his set and went to bed. He never heard the distress call. But the strangest part of the whole night is something that has never been explained. Both ships reported a third ship. At 11:30, Californian was stopped, boxed in by ice. Her captain stood on deck and saw the lights of a ship to the south. He asked the operator what was nearby. The answer? Only Titanic. Still unsure, he raised his binoculars, stared for a long time, and said with certainty, "That is not Titanic." Why? Because he knew Titanic was 880 feet long, a ship lit up like a palace on the water. What he saw through the glasses was under 300 feet, deck lights dim, a small cargo steamer. At the same time, on Titanic's bridge, officers saw a ship to the north, and they were certain it wasn't Californian, because the wireless operator had said Californian was 20 nautical miles off. 23 miles. The light in front of them was 5 miles away. 8 kilometers. Close enough that the captain, loading the first lifeboats, gave this order. Row to that bright ship. Put your passengers aboard, then come straight back for the next group. Fourth Officer Boxhall testified, I judged her distance from us at only 5 or 6 miles. Then she slowly turned until we could only see her stern light. But Californian was locked in ice all night, avoiding the floes. How did she turn? How did she leave? How did she show only a stern light? Boxhall went further. I am sure she was within 5 miles. You could see not just her stern light, you could clearly see her side lights. So what was this ship that nobody can explain? For more than 110 years, because there was no answer, it was passed around as a conspiracy theory. Then, the full-size reconstruction gave a reasonable explanation. Another 45 minutes down, 12:45, Titanic fired her first distress rocket toward that ship's lights. On Californian, it looked like someone was setting off fireworks on deck. A distress rocket should burst hundreds of feet up. Why didn't it look that way? Because of what nature had built over the ocean that night. That same refraction layer. The two ships were lying to each other's eyes. Each one thought the other was a third, unknown vessel. Californian saw Titanic looking far too small. Titanic saw Californian looking far too close. And there's one more thing. Titanic had swung a long S-curve across the water. When she finally stopped, her bow was pointing north, almost straight at Californian, which means Californian was looking at Titanic's bow, not the blazing broadside of the largest ship in the world, just a narrow silhouette, a handful of lights. As the water rose, Titanic's deck became something the movie got mostly right. An elderly couple, holding each other, taken by the sea. That was real. Isidore and Ida Strauss, who owned Macy's, she gave up her place in a lifeboat to stay with her husband. Chaos on deck. And a band, still playing. That was real too. Their bandmaster was Wallace Hartley. His violin survived. It still exists. And there was the officer. In the film, he takes a bribe, shoots a passenger in the panic, and then turns the gun on himself. That officer was First Officer William Murdoch. Hero or coward? For more than 110 years, there was no answer. When the film came out, Murdoch's hometown in Dalbeattie, Scotland, protested formally. They demanded a public apology. It was never really forgiven. A vice president of the studio flew to Scotland in person and laid a wreath at Murdoch's memorial. But the record was always strange. Of the roughly 710 survivors, close to 400 came off Murdoch's starboard side. Some said that was because Murdoch bent the rule. After women and children, he let men board too. Then, in 2025, investigators went back to the full-size scan. And they found it. The starboard davit is still in position, rigged and swung out. Which proves that at the end, with the sea already past his knees, Murdoch had not given up. He was still trying to launch the last collapsible boat. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who survived, said the same thing in the inquiry, and again in a letter to Murdoch's widow. I was the last man to see Murdoch. He was working to free the last boat when the sea took him. The stories about how he died are absolutely false. Murdoch died at his post, and on that freezing deck, he was not alone. Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the richest men aboard, worked out that the ship was going down and that there were nowhere near enough boats, so he went back to his cabin with his valet, and the two of them changed into evening dress. He left a message for the survivors. We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen. No woman shall be left aboard this ship, because Benjamin Guggenheim was a coward. They were last seen sitting in the tilting lounge, having a drink. Thomas Andrews, the man who designed her, was the first person that night to work out that Titanic was going to sink. He knew, better than anyone, exactly how many minutes were left. He never used his authority to take a seat. The last time a survivor saw him, he was standing alone in the first-class smoking room, his lifebelt thrown aside, staring at the painting on the wall. And half an hour before that, he had been seen on the tilting deck, throwing deck chairs into the sea, one after another, so that anyone in the water might have something to hold. And there was Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest. Crew members took hold of him and tried to walk him to a lifeboat. Twice, he refused. In the last minutes, with the bow going under and hundreds of third-class passengers trapped in panic, he was seen holding a crucifix, leading people of different nationalities and different faiths in prayer. Nature had crushed the crowning achievement of human industrial engineering, but on that deck, it never touched their dignity. 2 a.m. The bow was already under. But deep inside her, in the boiler rooms, dozens of stokers, engineers, and electricians had not moved. From the moment she struck the ice, they had been fighting for over 2 hours. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell had an order from the bridge: whatever it costs, keep the steam up and the power on. Why not run? Because if the boilers stop, the generators stop. If the generators stop, the pumps stop, and Titanic goes down twice as fast. And the moment the power fails, every light on the ship goes out. 2,000 people on a tilting deck, in total darkness, in the middle of the Atlantic. Without light, the lifeboats cannot be launched at all. Everyone still aboard dies in the dark. Now picture where those men were standing. Freezing seawater coming up through the floor plates, past their ankles, past their knees, past their waists, and around them boilers still burning at over 1,000 degrees. Ice and fire meeting. A high-pressure boiler flooded by cold water can explode violently, and if those boilers had gone up at the bottom of the ship, Titanic would have been torn apart from the inside in seconds, long before the last boats got away. In the full-size scan of the wreck, investigators found 2 pieces of evidence on the seabed. The first, the heavy steam exhaust valves. More than 110 years later, they are still in the open position, which means that in the final minutes, an engineer climbed up over the boilers in rising ice water and vented the pressure by hand. He stopped the ship from exploding. The second, the boilers themselves. They were still fired when the sea reached them. The steel carries the scar of that thermal shock. Metal that contracted the instant freezing water hit red-hot iron. So picture their last stand, in a steel box, between ice and fire, with no way out. They could hear the hull screaming above them, and the escape ladders overhead were already sealed off by the sea. Joseph Bell and his engineers stayed. Not one of them came back. They kept the ship alive as fuel. They held the lights on until 18 minutes past 2. 2 minutes before Titanic broke apart. 20 past 2. The lights went out. Titanic died. The bow was gone. The stern swung high. Everything those men had bought with their lives had run out. And then, from below, a deep explosion. The bow and the stern tore apart, and the stern crashed back toward the water. Survivors described it as an explosion. In 1995, when James Cameron first went down in a mere submersible and saw the wreck, he said the stern looked like a giant bomb had gone off inside it. So was there really a torpedo? A submarine? That urban legend has been circulating for decades, and in 2022, when the Magellan team was scanning the wreck meter by meter, one of their own analysts, looking at the stern, said, "You would think the ship had been struck by some enormous missile. So what actually caused it?" For years, people assumed the boilers exploded, but the autopsy rules that out. The engineers below had already vented the pressure. The boilers never blew. So where did that violence come from? The answer is at the bottom, 12,500 feet down. Down there, the bow and the stern lie about 2,000 feet apart. The bow is relatively intact, still streamlined. You can still see the railings on the deck. 2,000 feet away, the stern is scrap. Close to a fifth of it is simply gone. And the strangest detail, the heavy steel plating around the destroyed section is blown outward. Outward, not inward. Here's what investigators believe happened. When the hull broke, the immensely strong double keel did not snap immediately. Instead, it became a chain. The bow, already flooded and accelerating downward, dragged on that chain and pulled the stern, which had been floating, back down into the water, until the keel finally failed and the two halves separated. Now the bow was full of water. Internal and external pressure were balanced, so it planed away into the dark at roughly 30 miles an hour and hit the seabed almost intact. The stern was completely different. When it was dragged under, it was still full of air, sealed compartments, storerooms, cargo holds, thousands of cubic meters of air trapped at surface pressure. As it fell, the pressure outside rose fast. The pressure inside did not, and at a certain depth, nature fired the missile. An implosion. Water crushed inward into those air pockets in a fraction of a second. The air was compressed violently, then rebounded. The force of that deep-sea implosion is genuinely comparable to a warhead. That is the explosion, and it happened inside a sealed steel warehouse. After it, the stern, with its shape destroyed, began to spiral as it fell. Like a grinder, it threw the contents of Titanic out behind it. Tens of thousands of personal belongings, furniture, coal. The debris field stretches for kilometers. Suitcases, shoes, lying in pairs where a body once was. 2:25. 5 minutes after Titanic went silent, Californian's officer on watch made his report. He had spent the night torn between acting and not acting. Now he could reassure himself. That ship doesn't seem to be in trouble. She's just slowly steamed away. But Titanic was on the bottom. Why did she look like she was leaving? Because as the bow flooded, the stern lifted higher and higher. Her profile against the horizon got smaller and smaller. And when the boiler rooms went under, every light went out at once. 23 miles away, that looked exactly like a ship turning away, shrinking toward the horizon, and finally disappearing into the night. He thought she had sailed off. In reality, Californian had just missed the last chance to reach the survivors in the water. 2:30. Titanic was gone. On the surface, floating wreckage and people in water below freezing. Then, only darkness. 3 hours later, 21 minutes to 6, the North Atlantic sun finally came over the horizon. The survivors in the lifeboats, close to freezing to death, saw a ship coming. It was not Californian. It was RMS Carpathia, a smaller liner that had picked up Titanic's distress call and run 58 miles at full speed through an ice field, risking her own hull all night. 8:30 in the morning. The rescue was over. Of roughly 2,200 passengers and crew, 710 climbed onto Carpathia's deck. The other 1,500 stayed in the North Atlantic. The unsinkable ship had been taken apart by physics, and the human accounting had only just begun. 3 days after Titanic sank, the White Star Line chartered a cable ship. They loaded her with 100 tons of ice, 100 coffins, embalming supplies, and 12 tons of pig iron. Then they sailed for the wreck site to recover the dead. What was the iron for? It was ballast, to weight bodies for burial at sea, because there were 100 coffins and far more than 100 dead. The bodies that were identified as first-class passengers were embalmed, placed in the coffins, and brought home. Most of the crew and third-class dead were sewn into canvas, weighted with that iron, and buried in the ocean where they were found. Even in death, the ship's class system held. That was the cruelest accounting of all. Then 73 years of silence. Company after company proposed expeditions, all of them failed. Until 1985, when the American explorer Robert Ballard, using detection technology developed to locate lost nuclear submarines, found her on the bottom for the first time. Titanic came back into the world. In 1995, Cameron dived repeatedly in mere submersibles and brought back footage that went into a film the whole world watched. And in 2022, on her 110th anniversary, Magellan mapped the entire site, 16 terabytes of data, and built a full-size digital twin. But that model didn't only give us the truth, it also delivered nature's final verdict, because the scan confirmed something worse than any iceberg. Those red formations hanging off the hull. For years, people assumed they were ordinary rust. They're called rusticles, and they are colonies of iron-eating bacteria, a species named Halomonas titanici, found on that wreck and named after it. They consume hundreds of pounds of the ship every day. The railing from the most famous shot in the movie, a long section of it has already collapsed and fallen away. The captain's bathtub is gone. The crow's nest, where 2 men watched for ice, is gone. Current models predict that sometime between 2030 and 2050, the main structure will suffer a catastrophic collapse. And then the ship that once represented the peak of human engineering will become a rust stain on the floor of the Atlantic, and the current will carry away what's left. The digital twin will be the only complete record that Titanic ever existed. In that scanned ocean, a pair of leather shoes, a twisted deck chair, a broken suitcase, things more moving than any film, and by then, already gone. 113 years ago, the Titanic, the largest moving object ever built by human beings, met a piece of floating ice, and in the end, none of it was a mystery. Not the iceberg that hid inside 3 layers of light, not the 2 sheets of paper, not the ship that seemed to sail away, not the explosion that was never an explosion. Every one of them was physics. Nature set a problem that night. We just weren't able to read it for 113 years. And the memory an entire generation shares, that has become history too.